welcome to Racing Green Live from Earthfest 2024. Today our guest host, Maeve Campbell, chats with Drew Purves from Google DeepMind on the power of artificial intelligence to revolutionize sustainability. In the conversation, Drew highlights AI's potential to tackle climate change and protect our planet by improving weather predictions, optimizing energy grids, aiding wildlife conservation, and so much more.
Welcome, Drew.
Hi, thanks. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming.
So I'll just give everyone a bit of background as to who you are so everyone's aware. So Drew Purves is a research scientist at Google's DeepMind, which is based here in King's Cross, where he co-leads a new sustainability program. Prior to Google DeepMind, Drew spent 18 years in ecological research and environmental data science at the University of Cambridge, University of York, Princeton, and at Microsoft Research in Cambridge. His special focus is on biodiversity and nature, and he enjoys explaining the AI revolution in layman's terms to reach diverse groups of people. Is that about right?
That sounds perfect. Thanks, Maeve. That's great.
Great. Thanks, Drew. So thanks for joining us today. Tell us a bit about yourself and how it is that you came to be here.
To go right back to the beginning, my dad was an electrician at the steelworks in Corby, and my mum was a nurse in the NHS, and I think that gave me a bit of a kind of work ethic that I still have today, and sometimes people say I overwork sometimes. Maybe that explains that. But the other thing that happened was my dad, this was back in the 80s as an electrician, and that was just the beginning of the computing revolution happening across the world, and Britain was playing a big part in that. So actually he moved over into the computing industry, because at the time actually they needed a lot of electricians to sort of maintain the machines. And based off that, he learned about the industry and encouraged me to get into computing, and he bought me my first computer called a Commodore 64. Mm-hmm. And that's where it all started. And maybe I'll come back a little bit to the sort of the biology and the sustainability, but one of the reasons I wanted to mention that today was because at the time there was a lot of excitement around this new technology. School kids were learning about it. There were all these coding clubs, and it was incredibly open to people from almost any background, just like me. And I think we're actually in another era that's the same today around AI. So we really are going through this incredible technological transition, arguably the most important technological transition in human history, and definitely the most important technological transition that any of us will ever see. And yet it's still really open. So actually anyone can get involved in this. And I'm particularly keen to encourage everyone to try it, especially young people, and so on. So that's the reason I wanted to sort of go right back to the beginning today.
Great, it's always good to go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
So we're talking about artificial intelligence today. My first question, just to really break it down, I don't want to assume anyone knows anything. I myself don't know that much. So what is artificial intelligence?
Yeah. And by the way, this is a great question that we still debate inside places like Google DeepMind.
Okay.
So, but our working definition is the simulation of human-like intelligent processes in computers to perform complex tasks and to learn. So you can think of that as the kind of philosophical definition, one of several. It's a decent one and the one that we use. But one of the key messages I think I would share with people today is that, we can keep, and it's an interesting debate, we can keep having that debate around the philosophy and what is AI and et cetera. But actually, the thing to be aware of nowadays is that when we say AI, we're really referring to a particular technology and set of methodologies that is powering the amazing advances that we're now seeing around us. And the way I would summarize that is in 4 words: scaled up deep learning. Scaled up deep learning. And if there's one phrase that I hope everyone might take away today, it would be that: scaled up deep learning.
Right. And what's deep learning?
Right. Actually, so if you don't mind, I might start on the scaled up bit.
Oh, fine.
I'll tell you why. So you're right. So there's deep learning, and there's scaled up. And so scaled up how? And so what's happened in those years since the 1980s is that computers have got a lot faster. So we have a lot more compute power. And so that's one way that we're scaling things up. We're scaling up hugely in terms of the amount of data that we're able to process using that compute. And then in terms of the deep learning, and we'll come back to that, I promise, those models, those deep learning models are getting much bigger. So there are these 3 dimensions of scaling up in terms of compute, data, and models. And together what that's done is taken us through this sort of inflection point where suddenly the combination of all of that scaling up with the deep learning is now leading to abilities in computers that are mind-blowing to the extent that computers are now routinely doing things that people in the field thought they might never be able to do, and they can already do it. And maybe if I could illustrate the extent to which we've scaled up, just in one simple way, is I started programming on that, as I mentioned earlier, on this computer called a Commodore 64. It was very exciting at the time. It was a really good computer. You could program it. I learned to, you had good computer games and so on. And what I have here with me is a good laptop. Thanks to Samsung, because we're here at Samsung today. So this is a good laptop. So here's an interesting question. Imagine I had a compute job that took 1 day on this laptop. So the question is, how long would that same compute job have taken on my Commodore 64? So maybe just take a few seconds, have a guess. People don't usually get this right, by the way, including my colleagues. So the answer is roughly 32,000 years.
Wow.
So it's a big difference. So the thing is, that's just how much computers got faster. Of course, the biggest AI models are not running on a laptop. They're running on specialist GPU architecture in data centers and many, many parallel versions of those. So the compute we're using for those is enormously more than a laptop. So what can you do with that level of compute? And the truth is, nobody actually knows, but we're finding out right now. That's why we're at this inflection point today. So that's the scaled up that's the scaled up part of the scaled up deep learning.
Interesting. This is all very complicated, but very interesting. So deep learning, tell us what that is.
So deep learning. So of course, yes, you can have all the compute and the data and all the scaling up, but you also need to find the right algorithms and models, so-called algorithms and models to run on those computers. And the ones that have turned out to be transformative are the ones that we refer to as deep learning. And these are algorithms that have a structure that's inspired by the structure of the animal brain. So they have virtual neurons and links between these neurons. They go under different names, like artificial neural nets and so on. And what makes them deep is that they tend to be made of layers of these neurons. And previously, we were only able to have 1 or 2 of those layers. But we've worked out methodologies that allow us to train, get these things to learn when they have many more of these layers. And that's what we mean by deep. I should probably do it that way, deep. That'd be wide, wouldn't it? But deep. So that's actually, so it's this special kind of model. And these models have several very important properties. So they can deal with much more complex inputs than we could ever deal with before. So things like images, large passages of text, code, videos, sound files, all of this sort of stuff. A lot of those are things that we as humans find quite easy to deal with. But historically, they were extremely difficult to deal with in machine learning. But deep learning can deal with it. They can also create extremely rich and complex outputs, like long passages of text and images and videos, as you would have been seeing. And that's what we refer to as generative AI. So generative AI, you might have heard that phrase. It means deep learning models that produce outputs that are so rich and complex that they're more like what we're used to thinking of as inputs. And then there are at least 2 more dimensions of the deep learning. So another one is that in between the inputs and outputs, the deep learning models are extremely flexible, and so they can deal with all kinds of internal processing, things like causal reasoning and combinatoric reasoning and so on, all of these sorts of things. And then last but not least, deep learning models benefit particularly from scale. So I mentioned the scale of compute and data and model size. And so the deep learning architectures are a bit like a kind of engine that runs particularly well on the fuel of compute and data and so on. So all of these things have come together, the scaling up and the deep learning, scaled up deep learning, there's that phrase, to take us through this staggering technological transition that's happening today.
And it really is a technological revolution, isn't it? I mean, there's no one not talking about AI at the moment. Whether people understand it is one thing, but it's definitely being talked about. So what does AI have to do with climate change?
So this is a really good question. And the first thing I would say is we need collectively to find out. So as a society, so this transition is so rapid, and this amazing new technology, AI, there are a couple of other dimensions that of this revolution that are happening at the moment. So as well as the individual models becoming more powerful, they're also becoming much more general. And we even use this term now, foundational models. So previously, even a few years ago, you would tend to have a model that was trained to do one thing with one kind of data, and another model trained to do something else with another kind of data. Increasingly, we're throwing all the data into these so-called foundational models, which can then be adapted and fine-tuned by downstream users for many different purposes. So what that means is then, stepping back, is that we have this new technology that's not only super powerful, but it's super general. So it can be applied to almost any problem in many different ways. So asking a question like, how can we apply AI to climate change today, is perhaps a little bit like asking in, let's say, 1910, how could we apply electricity to healthcare? You can imagine. Of course, there are endless ways we could do it.
Endless ways.
Yes. Now, I'm not trying to be evasive, I promise. But of course, I just want to make sure that we're all aware that it's actually up to us collectively to work out how to apply AI to the challenges of our time.
Yeah.
AI is like the technological transition of our time. The challenges of our time are environmental challenges, first and foremost, or sustainability challenges. So obviously the people connection as well. So we think about all of those challenges together. And again, I come back to thinking about the next generation. When the more we can do to enable the next generation to learn about AI, skill up, and be able to use them. People like me and my colleagues might have invented some of these methods, but it's primarily up to the next generation now to work out what to do with it. So
absolutely,
yeah.
And so, humans up until now, obviously, climate change is man-made, but so is AI, made by man, essentially, or woman.
That's right.
And so if we think about it like that, we've been trying our best to address and tackle climate change for the last, 50 years or less, maybe more seriously. How could AI help us with kind of innovation and tackling things like carbon emissions? For example, would AI, if AI is cleverer than us, cleverer than our brains, would it be able to, for example, invent an engine for a plane that isn't run on fossil fuels?
So these are really good questions. So I know it might have sounded a bit broad. So yeah, let's talk about some specifics then, some specific ideas. So actually, one thing you mentioned there is the idea that AI is cleverer than us. And I think it's interesting to think, the way I would encourage people to think instead is that it's highly intelligent, but there's sort of different kind of intelligence to us. And so really, you get the best solutions to problems when humans interact with AIs in a positive way. So you should always think of AI as being something that is there to empower people. Yeah. And the most powerful applications tend to be repeat iterations of individuals or groups of humans interacting back and forth with the AI. So as far as what you could do, some of the things that you might think about are when you take climate change as a problem, you can think of some frameworks, and I'll give a couple of examples. Like you could think we still have some new understanding that we need to form. Some of these modern AI models are particularly good at integrating together different sources of information. And in that way, we might be able to get that first base level of understanding of different problems. So one example would be, the historic wet February that we had here, or the terrible wildfires and droughts that we had last summer, for example. Yeah. There's a question, which aspects of climate actually are driving different aspects of the weather system like that? And so what would you see there? The output might be scientific conclusions and so on. So that's an understanding piece. But you could also think about taking existing systems and using AI to make them more efficient. You could think of that as optimization. So for example, we have a project in Google DeepMind that we've just gone public about, which is looking at something called optimal power flow in electricity grids. So this is an algorithm that you need to run in order to balance the movement of electricity through electricity grids. And we've been able to produce a deep learning model that can solve that algorithm thousands of times faster than previous models. And that will enable us to, we think, enable not us, but partners out there in the world to make the electricity grids more efficient, particularly in an era when we're bringing in renewable technologies, which tend to have more unpredictable or at least rapid increases and decreases in supply and so on, and demand. So that's an example of optimizing. You could think about using AI to make scientific breakthroughs that might really change some of the sort of constraints around the problem. So for example, again, referring back to Google DeepMind, the work I'm most familiar with, we've trained AI models to control fusion reactors. So it's a major challenge, as you know, controlling the plasma inside the tokamak. And if only we could learn to do that better, that might unlock fusion, which in principle could be a much cheaper and cleaner source of energy. So there's multiple things we can do.
So it's kind of, maybe more efficient algorithms, scientific breakthroughs. And then going back to what you were saying about wildfires, how could AI, in very simple terms, help us with extreme weather?
Well, so the first thing to think about there is that weather prediction is a very challenging problem. And actually, interestingly enough, if you like, I find these reports useful. The World Economic Forum recently identified extreme weather as the top risk to the global economy over the next 10 years. So it's literally the most, according to their analysis, it's the most important thing. So, of course, historically, we've had weather models, but the weather models tended to have been a bit limited in their ability, especially to predict the extremes. And also, you've tended to need supercomputers to run them. So interestingly enough, we just had another release from Google DeepMind, actually back in December, where we showed how you could use deep learning to produce the best ever weather predictions. So we now have the best weather prediction system has come out of Google DeepMind. So that is, if you go forward a certain amount in time, it's the most accurate. Or if you're after a threshold accuracy, you can go out further in time than before. But the other interesting thing is that you can run that algorithm on a laptop. So what this does, that puts that kind of weather modeling in the hands of anyone with that amount of compute, which is a lot of people. That means you could then run ensemble model predictions to really help to understand those extremes. So, of course, the model itself is not adapted around extremes, but it could be adapted and moved in that direction.
Yeah.
So, of course, that's not by itself going to solve extreme weather. It will enable us to predict extreme weather further out.
Yeah.
And that goes under the label that we sometimes call adaptation. So the idea of adaptation is you kind of, when you're in adaptation mode, you accept the climate change that's happening, but you say, okay, but if we can predict ahead of time, we can do something about it, whether that's very rapidly. Yes, exactly. Yeah. That's separate to mitigation. Of course, mitigation is around actually trying to reduce carbon emissions and other sources of climate change.
Yeah. Interesting. So I can see why that would be really helpful, especially in particular parts of the world that are very prone to extreme weather.
That's right.
And I know that
actually, sorry, if you don't mind me, I should have said this, but one thing I keep coming back to is, do you remember last year in the wildfire outbreak?
Of course.
I mean, there were huge numbers of tourists that went out to Greece, and then the wildfires broke out, and a lot of them were trapped there, and we had to move them all back. And you kind of think, shouldn't we have predicted that? Maybe they never should have gone to Greece in the first place. And that's the point about adaptation. If we could have predicted those events a week or two ahead, you could imagine the difference that could have made.
And save lives. I mean, that's right. Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry.
Very important. And I know that your specialism is on biodiversity and nature. So let's talk about that for a moment. How is it more about, about efficiency? Is it about data sets in biodiversity and nature? How can AI help with the nature crisis? Because that's something we're also facing. Yeah, that's right. I mean, so I'm sure people are aware. I mean, at a local level, I think all of us recognise that we're concerned about nature. Britain has unfortunately, a particularly bad record in terms of the impact we've had on our ecosystem. We have a very strong record in terms of ecology and biodiversity research. It's just a shame that we also have a strong record in partially destroying our own biodiversity. But so I think a lot of us are concerned at a local level. And again, one thing that excites me is I see even more concern in the next generation that's coming up. But we also now recognise at the global scale, actually, that nature loss and biodiversity is a major challenge, both in itself. Like I think values-wise, none of us want to see biodiversity loss globally. According to the latest estimates, something like 40% of all species are threatened with extinction. Animal population sizes, on average, have declined by 70% since I was born in the 70s. 70% just in my lifetime. So with these terrible statistics. But we also realise that biodiversity underpins all of ecosystem services that we all depend on as well. Things like pollination services in agriculture, more biodiverse ecosystems are better at regulating water. And last but not least, biodiversity is crucial to the way that ecosystems store carbon and in other ways regulate the global climate. So in fact, going back to that World Economic Forum risk report, they put biodiversity loss as the third greatest risk on Earth, actually above a couple of other notable ones like international warfare. Wow.
So it's that important. And one thing that's happening in the world of environmental sustainability with climate is increasingly people are realizing that we need to treat climate, nature, and actually people. And we should come back to that. But climate, nature, and people is the key triangle that now we're all thinking about. So that kind of frames the challenge a little bit. Because the question, I suppose, for today is what will we do with AI? And again, it's a big area. And I think ultimately what we want to do is empower a whole rich ecosystem around the world of NGOs and government agencies, universities, and private companies. But when we come to the people side, we especially need to think about people and cultures around the world that historically have been quite disempowered. The global south, I think particularly about indigenous groups and so on. They're the people actually that are the the custodians of most of the world's biodiversity, and sometimes they can be left out of the discussion and so on. So the long-term goal, I think, is to think about AI as this ubiquitous technology that we do it correctly, rolls out into that ecosystem in a way that empowers people all the way around the world to protect nature for their own sake and for all of our sakes.
And what might be a more specific example, maybe when it comes to protecting endangered species or conservation, where AI could really play a role?
Yeah, exactly. That's quite right. So we have a framework that we use to think that I like to use. So it has 3 parts, and I always think of them spatially. So let's put them here, here, and here up in the air. So here is this is using AI to bring in more observations and data. So it's AI-assisted data gathering, or you could think of it as monitoring, or by analogy with the brain, you could think of it like perception. So one really good example of that is, in fact, it's a long-term Google project called Wildlife Insights. So we can take these little cameras now, these motion-activated wildlife cameras, the sort of thing you strap to a tree, and then when animals walk past them, it takes a picture. And that technology's been around for a while. In fact, the idea of these network devices, of course, is another part of this constellation of technologies alongside AI. But the problem is they create enormous amounts of data. So historically, humans had to look at every single one of those images. But nowadays, it's becoming routine to take these images and process them with AI. So now we can identify the species automatically.
Wow.
So that's on the monitoring side. We have a related project called Perch, a close colleague of mine called Tom, who's working on this. And that's similar, but it's using microphones. So that's so-called bioacoustics, where you can deploy these little microphones in the field, and they can pick up all the bird song, they can pick up bats. And again, they create terabytes of data, but now we can process them. So that's on the monitoring side.
Wow.
Of course, if you do that, you then create enormous amounts of useful data, huge amounts. So now that then pushes the challenge onto the next stage to say, well, what do you do with it? So the middle part over my head here is this idea of AI-assisted integrative modeling. So this is where you take all of the data that we have, and that includes things like the species data, but also related data like remote sensing data, language data in the scientific literature, whatever. You put this all together, and then that enables us to build systems that can either predict places that we've never been to, or predict into the future, which we call forecasting. So, and we talked about weather modeling earlier. You can think about the one here, the monitoring is a bit like weather stations, but for nature. This is a bit like weather modeling then for nature.
So we can kind of predict the future with AI in some ways.
That's right, yeah. So we might, we talked about that, I talked about that trend of the populations dropping during my lifetime. So then we might be able to use AI to project where they're going to drop the most, where they might turn around. And there's a very important form of forecasting, arguably the most important, which we call counterfactual forecasting. That's actually if-then. So we say, well, okay, it's one thing to predict what's going to happen. What we really want to know is how can I turn it around? So what can we do? Is it about reintroducing species, creating a protected area? Is it about introducing biodiversity credits? Is it about trying to, let's say, mitigate the impact of invasive species? Is it about changing harvesting quotas and so on and so on? So all those different things. And then that leads partly onto the last one. I'll finish in a second, I promise.
That's okay,
I'll rubbising a bit.
Take your time.
So there was the monitoring here, there's the modeling here. So of course, if both of those go really well, you're in danger then of creating an enormous amount of information for the actual humans that ultimately need to make decisions, kind of information overload. And this is the third, and I think at the moment, one of the most exciting applications of AI is in the active support of decision-making. So given this enormous amount of information, individuals, but actually more often groups of people, whether that's a group of people in a government agency, or for instance, a local conservation community group, or an indigenous group, can actually use the AI to distill that information down into a small number of decisions and help the AI. The AI can then help them to identify the pros and cons of those decisions in order to make the best decisions on how to act. So decision support, So those three sort of monitoring, modeling, and decisions as a framework.
So when you say helping with decision making, is that something, because we need a bit of help, with that, I'd say in the UK, maybe our politicians could do with a bit of AI helping them out with decision making. Is that something that could be rolled out on a bigger scale? Could we be helping governments change policy with this?
Yeah. Well, absolutely right. And in fact, I've been having a few conversations myself with some government agencies and so on, because I think, and this goes back a little bit to this, one of the key elements of the current AI revolution around these so-called foundational models. Now, And the most obvious foundational models at the moment are so-called large language models. Talks about scaling up like large. That's why in fact, the biggest ones have about 1 trillion parameters. So for those who know about them, they're big. But so what's amazing about those, of course, these AI methods, is that as a human being, you can actually interact with them with language. And of course, this is the most obvious face of AI today. You know this, the chat GPTs and or Gemini from Google and so on, these things. So a couple of years ago, the idea of active deployment of AI for decision support perhaps seemed like it was a long way in the future. Mm-hmm. But these language-based models are already very useful for guiding people through any decision makings. I use them. They're very good at identifying some of the key issues and so on. Now, ought to be super clear, we need to be cautious. The models still have problems. They have biases. They can sometimes be inaccurate. So you really need to go in with your eyes open. But they're developing so rapidly that actually, so the era is already there. So some of the examples, the way you can use them, so-called zero shot, is where you just start talking to them, and that would be the most familiar one that most people would be used to. But these models now, they have an input. You put an input in, and you get an output back out. And the input is called the context window. It's the amount of data that you can put in, and that's become enormous on some of these models recently. So the Google's Gemini model, for example, you can go up to 1 million so-called tokens. So what that means is, if you want to know about an area, yes, you could do it zero shot, but you could actually load the model with loads. You could put reports in there, scientific articles. If you're in an organization, you can load in your own private documents, right? And so it's a bit like, you can think of the model in itself as almost like a new joiner, like a new starter at a company.
Yeah.
Right? And then what you do is you put it on its training regime. So you go, okay, fine, you're very smart in general, but you need to know about our organization, our community, and our challenges. So you load it up with all of this information, and then it becomes much more useful. And then last but not least, you can actually, if you want to go advanced, and you can fine-tune the model. So you can actually adjust the models against that data to become even better. And so this is completely within reach now. What I'm describing is not some imaginary exercise. Like if you're a group of people, it's quite possible for you to use the models in zero shot or to prompt them or to get started on fine-tuning. And so, of course, like a lot of this, though, like any new technological transition, we have to work out what best practices are.
Yes, and that brings me, because you were mentioning, you mentioned biases. And I think, when people think about AI, they often worry that there could be a spread of misinformation, because if these models are reading, hundreds or millions of pages on the internet, for example, or within a specific organization, even then, who kind of fact checked AI? How do we know, especially with climate change and climate denialism, getting worse and worse? How can we trust the information that we get from AI?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up. So one of the things, I remember when I'd had all those years head down on environmental data science. And actually, when I switched to DeepMind, I went into more fundamental AI research mode. And the reason I did was that I read about DeepMind, and here was suddenly people talking about AI, which actually people weren't talking about much in 2015, right? It was kind of seen as like a sort of sci-fi type adventure from the 50s and 90s that hadn't quite worked out. And I was like, but at the time, it felt like with the work I was doing at Microsoft Research and elsewhere, we were sort of hitting the limits on what we could do with the methods that we had. And so I was really excited to get the chance to come and visit and talk to DeepMind. But one of the first questions I asked was about all of the safety and responsibility aspects. And the good thing was that was already part of the story right back then. They believed this AI revolution was coming, and therefore they believed that, like any other technological transition, it would have all these important elements. Now, as a lot of the fundamental research has come on, and so with all the scaling up and the clever methodologies and the deep learning, really a lot more of the interesting questions now are about the people and the ecosystem side, which are incredibly important. Who's using these models and for what purpose? And the ecosystem is a bit like, how is data being shared around? How are models being shared around, et cetera? So all of that side, but also these responsibility issues. So actually what people might not realize, for example, when you picture AI, it's tempting to think of just like some cybernetic kind of data center brain, off on the top of a mountain or somewhere in a desert. And actually, when I think of AI, I think about hundreds and hundreds of people working together. Right? Yes, the data centers are off there in the background, but actually it's people that are thinking, what's the data that we should be putting in? How do we train the models? And so we're developing all kinds of new methods on the data side to pre-filter out toxic content, for example. but then when the models are ready, we then have huge numbers of people that actually interact with these models, and then they rate the outputs and they help us to correct the outputs to make them more accurate, and again to remove as much as possible biases and inaccuracies and so on. So it's this huge sort of human endeavor actually that's happening in organizations like Google DeepMind to create the models that we produce. Also, it's really important to realize that there's a lot of talk and discussion going on in the regulatory space.
Okay. So that's policy?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, places like Google DeepMind and Google more generally have been very strong in actually calling for more regulation. People often think, companies like ours just want a free-for-all. Yeah. And that's actually not the case because we really are aware of the potential dangers of AI.
And do we have policy frameworks at the moment in the UK or globally to regulate AI?
Yes, they're just beginning now. Yeah, exactly. So there have been some new bodies that have been created. There's an AI Safety Institute here in the UK. And there are some new regulations coming in around in the EU, for example. I think they are here already, actually, around the way that we have to use data in training the models and so on. And this will only increase. So of course, it's a whole combination. But ultimately, it is something that collectively we need to solve. I wouldn't want to encourage anyone to be complacent about this. The way that AI rolls out in the future will depend on. It will depend on some of these outsized important nodes, like the Google DeepMinds, and I see us really working hard, taking this very seriously internally. But it also depends on the way the rest of the ecosystem, governments, the other private companies, the NGO space, and even individuals interact with these. One thing I was reflecting actually on the train on the way here, Maeve, was thinking, in 100 years, what are the stories that people are going to tell about this century? And of course we don't know. And there'll probably be quite a few of them, but it seems pretty clear that one of those stories will be about AI, and another one will be about environmental sustainability. And so the question is, what's that story going to be? And I think we're writing it right now. There's two stories.
Yeah, that's a very positive perspective, and I think there's a lot of truth in it. And I've got to ask, this is always the question that people want to know: is there a danger that AI becomes so powerful that it kind of takes over and machines start kind of walking around the offices and, people become obsolete?
Right. Yes. Well, so let's unpack that. So the short answer is yes, there is a danger of that. And that might be an unexpected answer, but
okay.
It goes under the flag of sometimes we call it existential risk. So these are unintended consequences of AI that are so bad that they might threaten the continued existence of humanity and so on. Now, we think it's a low risk, but it's not a zero risk. And so for that reason, existential risk has been taken seriously, again, from day one in places like Google DeepMind. So we do talk about this. And so part of the discussion is around putting limits and controls in place that would prevent these kind of runaway scenarios of AI. Because if too much AI got concentrated in too few places in a way that was too connected with the rest of the world, that could, there are some, again, low probability, but kind of high consequence kind of actions that could happen. So that is something that's taken seriously. Having said that, most of the safety and regulatory discussion, and probably quite rightly, is around actually the known dangers and risks that are much more probable, even if they're slightly less worrying risks, like things like, but they're still very serious, things like bias. You might be aware, when we say bias, we mean things like, so when you train these models on the data that you find, let's say, on the internet, they're actually a reflection of our biases. So the models bake in the biases of the internet, if you like. And so that's an example of something that happens right now. Very simple example, if you're not careful, the models will think that all doctors are male. Things like this, right? Things like that. But there are many more serious ones. You can imagine how serious biases like that could get. Yeah. So, of course, people have worked on methods to try to correct those sorts of biases and made a lot of progress. So, so when we identify a problem and work on it, we can choose it. So, I suppose the bulk of the effort is on those known sort of near-term risks. But to be clear, people are thinking very carefully around those longer-term so-called existential risks. There is something else I would say with that, though, and this is kind of a bit of a personal view of mine, of course, but we shouldn't forget that, that there are also existential risks of not rolling out AI. I mean, if you're having a look at what's going on with climate or biodiversity or any other, a number of other dimensions of environmental sustainability, quite before we get onto some of the socioeconomic aspects of sustainability, things like global inequality, education, et cetera, there are a lot of existential risks. And so it it really does point to this balance then of thinking, well, we're facing existential risk like this. AI is I think is certainly going to be a major part of the solution to all of those. We can't solve them without AI. So we have to balance different sources of existential risk against each other.
I think that's a very good point, because the crisis that we're facing is existential. So if part of the way that we tackle it is, yes, through something that has many dangers inherent within it, but the potential is so huge, it kind of balances out, in your opinion.
I think that's right, or at least the way to think about it. I think that's really good, Maeve, actually. Thanks. That's distilled it down in a useful way, because you're right. Ultimately, it comes down to balancing the potential benefits and potential risks.
Yeah.
And I think we could obviously do that at the most global scale. Would be should we be pursuing AI at all? Or that can come all the way down to particular areas and particular applications. So, if you're an individual or a small group of people applying AI, you want to take the same lens each time you make a decision. When you bring in some data, are you going to release the model? How are you going to make it available? It's all about balancing the benefits and risks.
Yeah. Another thing I have to ask you about, we've got about 5 minutes left, is energy. Because what we're talking about is tackling climate change, using technology that is incredibly high energy. It takes a lot of energy to run. Now, we've just had a panel on renewables. Hopefully we're moving towards more of a renewable revolution. But how does that balance out? Is AI kind of worth it if it takes so much power to run?
I'm really glad you mentioned that. So that's when we think of the sort of overall responsibility, safety, and ethics story around AI, then one of the other classes that we want to think about is the unintended environmental consequences. You're absolutely right. And yes, that extends to the energy use in the big data centers, for example, but don't forget also the creation of the hardware, so the mining of the materials, etc. So there's quite a lot going on there. One thing I really do want to point out is, remember I mentioned how the largest models today, I think, are using about 1 trillion times more compute than the largest models in 2010. That doesn't mean they're using 1 trillion times more energy. So actually, it's another one of these balancing equations. So actually, compute is becoming much more energy efficient, much more energy efficient. So one example is, this laptop I mentioned, right, probably uses less energy than my Commodore 64. So just to be clear, so it's a balance between the increased demand for the compute and the energy efficiency of that compute. The large companies like Google are taking the energy side very seriously. So actually, the data centers do run on renewables. They're working ways to make them more energy efficient. So I think they're 50% more energy efficient now than they were like 3 years ago. And they're working on tools that enable us to track the energy use of each training run of a model, or each time the model is called. So it's quite exciting. There is another thing I think which is exciting here too, which is, I mentioned this foundational model idea. So what's happening is a small number of organizations like Google DeepMind are able to create the very largest, most powerful models. These are the foundational models. But actually, most of the energy is in training and creating them in the first place. For downstream users, actually adapting those, fine-tuning them with your own data, and even running the models can be done with dramatically less energy. So this is an example, actually, of not a hardware sort of technology. This is more like the methods and the software evolving in a way that actually means that on aggregate, the whole ecosystem is much more energy efficient in its use of AI, because you've got a few bright hotspots, and then a long tail of a much more, if you like, frugal, small, energy efficient models.
Yeah.
And another thing I would point out as well, I think it's ultimately all of these questions actually and thanks for all the questions, Maeve, because you touched on some great topics here, by the way. I think they do come down in a way to values and ethics and what we're pointing this out. And I think the message is, when we identify important things, and when we put, if we care about them, we measure progress against them, and we put regulation around them. That then drives innovation. So the more we care about the energy use of AI, the more we can do about it,
and the more efficient it will become.
Yeah, whether that's hardware, whether that's that software and the methods and so on, will come. So I think, and maybe it goes back to that story point. To be clear, there's a kind of easy path for AI where we just throw ever more energy and ever more materials at it, and at which point I think it would be reasonable for people to think, well, you're using them for the environment, but look at the environmental consequences of AI. But that's not the only path available to us. There are much better paths that we can take from now that would be much more energy efficient. It's
good to know that there's particularly at Google, that the big factory or the big data centers are being run on renewable energy, and hopefully the other companies are doing the same, although I don't know. So before we finish, I'd just like to ask you, what are you feeling most hopeful about, and what do you feel most optimistic about in relation to AI in the future?
The next generation. I know I mentioned that a few times. I think for different reasons, but I think I heard this talk I found quite thought-provoking from an anthropologist at Google, the sort of thing we do sometimes to bring people in. And she said that she thought this is how kind of human societies actually develop, that one generation develops the technology and the next generation works out what to do with it. And that's why I'm so excited about the next generation. I think just in general, right? Yeah. Just to see what they're going to do with this technology. I think another one, though, is... it's the first time I've cut a blank. Give us a second. I think I'll get back. I know what it is. It goes back to values again, which is, when I started out in ecology, nobody cared about ecology. It was a really weird thing to get into. I was into it when I was 16, and honestly, it wasn't really on the A-level curriculum. Nobody talked about ecology. Those letters eco, it didn't really exist. Eco, it wasn't a thing at all, right? And even over the years, as I've talked about biodiversity preservation, sometimes I felt like I've had to kind of make a case for nature, like this is why nature's important and we should do it. And people go, why should I care? Why does that matter? The next generation, they don't ask those questions. They're like, of course the environment matters and so on. And I think it's almost like the next generation is getting back actually to a sort of philosophy, if you like, of our relationship with nature that's much more like most of human history. In most of human history, the economy was the environment. And we were part of the ecosystem, and then we sort of had this 200 or 300 year experiment around, the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, thinking that we could separate humans from the rest of the environment, and that's brought, to be fair, amazing benefits and some lessons. But I think the next generation realizes, yeah, fine, but now we need to get back to seeing us as part of the environment again. So again, I think all of that together, I think the fact that this new technology is happening around us at such a rate, it's such a transition. The fact that it's so open that actually anyone can get started with this technology. You can even ask the AI how to get started with AI, right?
Yeah.
That combined with that natural energy and the values of the next generation coming up that think about the environment often first before anything else, I think that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah. Well, we've got it seems quite an intergenerational room, so maybe we're looking at the next AI entrepreneurs right now.
Yeah, exactly.
All ages. Thank you so much, Drew. Let's give Drew a big round of applause.
Thanks.